Welcome to this series of videos on Edexcel GCSE history, specifically the medicine through time topic. Today's video will be on the supernatural explanations for disease that were used in the medieval period. First of all, I think it's really important that we start with some periodization. So the medieval period lasted between the years 1250 to 1500, and that's the definition of the exam board. So those are the years that we're going to be using. And it was a completely different world from the world in which we inhabit. The average life expectancy was between the ages of 30 to 35, which really captures the fact that medical understanding and knowledge of science was really quite poor. There were some reasons for why there was so little progress in the medieval time. The first reason was the nature of the government. So the fact that the king at the time would have been more focused on collecting taxes, winning wars and fighting battles, rather than the needs of his people. It's only in the 19th century, when we actually see democracy being introduced, that people's governments start to represent their interests. In the medieval period, this was simply not the case. Another reason why the progress was so poor was because of most people's work. So most people, about 90% of the population, actually worked as peasants on the farms. And given that they're peasants who are farming all day, they're not going to be needing to know how to read and write, and therefore there are less knowledgeable people to move medicine forward. And the most important reason, which is the one that the exam board specifies you must know, is the role of the church. Now, the church controlled almost all aspects of medieval life. So monasteries were incredibly important, and people would spend a lot of time going to church, especially on Sundays, of course. Over 99% of the population was religious, specifically following the religion of Catholicism, and as such they followed exactly what the church told them. The church also was in charge of all education, and although 50% of people in towns could read and write, the majority of books were religious books in nature, and that's because the printing press had not yet been invented. All books that were produced were copied by hand by monks who would spend all day essentially copying out books by hand. So how is all of this linked to medicine? Well, the key tenet of what the church taught was that all disease was sent as a punishment from God, and that actually disease could be interpreted as a test of faith. This was notably seen in the Black Death, the worst disease in the medieval period, where the prior of Christ Church Abbey actually said the following. So he said that the Black Death had been sent by God, who used suffering to drive out the numberless sins of the people. And in addition to the Black Death, leprosy was also explained by people's sins. So the Bible actually taught or teaches that leprosy is a disease caused by people's sins, and that God is punishing people for those sins. Now, lepers suffered from pretty horrific symptoms, including blistering on both the inside and outside of their bodies, the loss of function of limbs, and some limbs would actually drop off, and then ultimately leading to paralysis and death. There were no treatments available at the time, and most lepers were forced to live outside of their kind of towns and communities and were socially shunned. In fact, many of them had to wear bells to alert others of their presence. There were a few lazar houses dotted around the country, which were staffed by monks and nuns. Those were usually situated on the outskirts of a town or community, but those were few and far between. In the exam, you might use the word lazar house, or sometimes historians refer to them as leper colonies. Now, in addition to the church explaining disease away as a punishment from God, they also discouraged progress by preventing dissection. As a result, physicians lacked a real understanding of human anatomy, and it wasn't until the Renaissance period with Andreas Vesalius that was actually remedied. Those of you targeting the grade 9, you might also want to mention the fact that there was some progress made within the church. So, for example, Roger Bacon, a 13th century monk, actually told people to go away and not rely on Galen and Hippocrates' work, but to actually start thinking for themselves and to observe their patients' symptoms. However, Bacon was tried for heresy, was put in prison, which would suggest that actually the church ultimately stymied progress for much of the medieval period. Alongside the church, there were also other explanations which would fall under the supernatural category, most notably astrological explanations. Now, astrology refers to the position of stars, and physicians would consult star charts and also something called the zodiac man, which was a 12-point diagram which linked different parts of the body to different star signs. It was through this that physicians would be able to determine what a patient's problem was and ultimately the correct course of treatment. Now, physicians would never provide the treatment themselves, but they would be able to signpost a patient to a barber surgeon or would be able to recommend a herbal remedy from an apothecary. For the exam as well, you might also want to mention in the case of astrology that the Black Death was explained away by physicians as the result of a misalignment of some of the malevolent planets, or as they called them, stars back then. Specifically, the positioning of Saturn and Jupiter was associated with the spread of the Black Death. Right, that concludes the supernatural explanations of disease video. I'll see you in the next video for rational explanations of disease in the medieval period.